One aspect of the justice system that I find just beautiful, and that's the presumption of innocence. Like, what does that mean? Well, every person is presumed innocent when they walk into the courtroom. And I have conversations with juries about this every single time we have a jury trial. Like, hey, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, sitting here right now, is my client, is he innocent, guilty, or I don't know? I mean, because I don't know is a fair answer, because where there's smoke, there's fire. The guy is in the courtroom, probably did something wrong. Obviously, a lot of people are being inconvenienced. There's a judge, there's a clerk, there's all these people, there's people in the courtroom, there's like dozens of jurors for jury selection. Like, didn't he do something wrong? And that's a natural instinct for some people. But in the United States, in a free country, in a free civilized society, you're presumed innocent, because it's the sole burden of proof on the state, on the government, to produce evidence and prove their case. So for instance, if we walked into a courtroom and I was presumed to have done something wrong, that wouldn't be fair, because the defendant doesn't have a burden of proof. The state does. And that's why the presumption of innocence is so beautiful. But it is also confusing, because in a case, the burden of proof is on the state to prove the case beyond a reasonable doubt. So you get through the evidence, the person's presumption of innocence is there until they deliberate. But when they're deliberating, they may think, well, he probably did it. Look at all this evidence. And that's where you get to the burdens of proof, because on a more likely than not scale, like if we were doing a civil jury trial, where if it's 50% plus one in the scales of justice, then that person is not guilty in a criminal case, but would be guilty or would be found liable in a civil case, for instance. That's just not good enough when you're talking about people's liberties, about their driving rights, about all the collateral consequences that come along in a criminal case in a free society. So if it's 50% plus one, the answer is not guilty. And then you have the highest standard of all, and that's proof beyond a reasonable doubt. And then somewhere below that, you have clear and convincing evidence. And I've always found that definition to be kind of circular. Well, it's evidence that's convincing and clear. I'm minimizing it and paraphrasing, but the answer is it's somewhere in your conscience. You're clearly convinced, and that's below proof beyond a reasonable doubt. And that's what we use for the civil death penalty, which is termination of parental rights proceedings. Like, to steal a baby from a parent permanently, you got to prove it not beyond a reasonable doubt by clear and convincing evidence instead. So then you get to the ultimate standard that protects us from the government, and that's proof beyond a reasonable doubt. What does that mean? And when have you ever used it in your own daily life? I used to watch these old lawyers back when I was a young lawyer, and they would say, hey, you probably made a decision with proof beyond a reasonable doubt in your daily life, like when you bought a house or chose a wife or a husband. And I always thought, oh, that makes sense. Yeah, people are making decisions based upon reviewing all the evidence, pluses and negatives, and then deciding if they have a moral certainty about the result. And then I became a little more experienced in the practice of law. So we started doing family law cases, and I have friends and family members that got divorced, and it's clear that people are doing very limited due diligence on their spouses, and probably even less due diligence on the houses that they buy, which was evidenced in the financial crisis in 2008, the mortgage crisis, that people were having mortgages they couldn't afford. So I don't think people have a lot of experience making decisions based upon being beyond a reasonable doubt. So proof beyond a reasonable doubt is when you have a question, a doubt that is based upon reason. Well, what does that mean? Well, if your doubt is based upon the way the person looks, like their skin color, or they're wearing a plaid shirt and you don't like plaid, that would be an unreasonable doubt. You can't have doubt based upon that and find somebody not guilty. But if your doubt is based upon the evidence, if it's based upon conflicting evidence, or it's based upon the lack of evidence, and something that happened in the courtroom or didn't happen in the courtroom that you would expect to see in a reasonable case, then that would be a reasonable doubt. And that kind of dovetails back to what in the world, when in the world do we ever make a decision based upon a reasonable doubt? And the only example I've ever actually been able to come up with that that kind of withstands the scrutiny of jurors and jury selection. Have you ever had to make a decision to take someone off of life support? I think most people are really checking the boxes. They're conferring with the experts. They're asking questions. They're scratching their heads a little bit. They're having doubts. And when they have doubts, they ask more questions. And at the end, if they don't know the decision because they have doubts, typically a tie goes to the runner, and they're not going to want to remove life support, for instance, because maybe there's still some additional chance that they would survive. And those are tough decisions. I'm sure there's other examples out there. I'd love for you to post some comments about some ideas that you have. Post down below. Like, when have you made a decision based upon proof beyond a reasonable doubt? Surely when you bought your car, it wasn't. It was probably a gut instinct. And a lot of people think that their gut instincts are beyond a reasonable doubt, at least that level. And maybe you're one of the lucky few, but most people, you could go left, you could go right. I'm going to go this way because it feels right. And I think that's proof by the preponderance of evidence. Now, if we didn't have that system, it would be terrifying, because the government could control us by virtue of charging people with crimes. And there'd be little way to protect us from the government, because it would be too easy to take away someone's liberty.